What if Europe wants to reduce its dependence on America, but discovers that it simply can't? Right now, tensions between Europe and the United States are rising. Donald Trump has imposed tariffs on European goods, talked about withdrawing US troops from Europe, and even suggested taking control of European territory. Because of this, European leaders are now seriously thinking about one thing: reducing their dependence on the United States, both economically and militarily. But here's the reality: Europe can reduce its military dependence, but economically and technologically, that's much harder. Because today, the United States is not just an ally, it is deeply embedded inside Europe's economy. The US is Europe's largest export market. More than 20% of all European exports go to America. At the same time, the US is also the dominant source of risk capital for European businesses. And on top of that, it provides critical military capabilities that help deter threats like Vladimir Putin. Now yes, Europe is increasing its defense spending, especially in Northern and Eastern Europe. And Europe is also funding Ukraine's defense, while trying to integrate Ukraine into its growing defense industry. So in military terms, Europe is slowly building independence. But economically, the situation is completely different. In theory, European governments could try to reduce dependence on the US. They could limit the use of American goods, services, currency, and technology. But in practice, this is extremely difficult, because to replace the US, Europe would need alternatives that are just as efficient, just as cheap, and just as technologically advanced. And right now, those alternatives do not exist. To build them quickly would come at a huge cost, either slower economic growth, lower productivity, or becoming dependent on other powers like China. And that creates a difficult choice. Europe can reduce dependence, but only by hurting its own economy. Now let's look at one of the biggest issues: money. European governments are increasingly uncomfortable with how dominant the US dollar is, because the United States can use access to the dollar system as a weapon through sanctions. But even if Europe wants to move away from the dollar, it can't do it easily. The European Central Bank is trying to promote the euro. It's expanding currency swap agreements and trying to strengthen its global role. But there is a major problem. The Eurozone does not have the political and fiscal integration needed to create deep and liquid financial markets like the US. And because of that, global investors still prefer the dollar. For businesses, dollar-based transactions are simply easier and more efficient. So even if governments want change, private companies are not willing to switch. The same problem exists in payments. Europe's economy is becoming increasingly cashless, but most transactions still rely on American systems. Companies like Visa and MasterCard handle around 2/3 of card payments in the euro area. Europe has tried for years to build its own alternatives, but it has struggled to scale them. There is no unified European system that can replace US payment infrastructure today. Yes, the European Central Bank is working on a digital euro, and it could eventually support a new independent payment system. But that system is not expected to be ready until the end of this decade. Now let's talk about energy. Nearly 25% of Europe's energy comes from natural gas. Before 2022, Russia was the main supplier, providing 40 to 45% of Europe's gas. But after the war in Ukraine, Europe cut Russian gas imports by about 75%. And that was only possible because of one thing: American LNG. US liquefied natural gas imports to Europe have more than quadrupled between 2022 and 2025, and they played a major role in stabilizing energy prices after the crisis. Today, the United States and Norway are Europe's most important gas suppliers, and this dependence is about to increase, because Europe has decided to completely eliminate Russian gas imports by 2027, which means Europe must find replacements quickly. Some supply can come from Norway, Algeria, or the Eastern Mediterranean, but most of the gap will have to be filled by LNG, and that means more dependence on the United States. Now add another layer of risk. If conflict in the Middle East escalates and LNG supplies from countries like Qatar are disrupted, Europe will have no choice but to rely even more on American energy, and Washington knows this. Recent trade agreements already include provisions that push Europe to import more US LNG, and US officials have made it clear: if Europe doesn't agree, there are other buyers. So energy is not just economics anymore, it's leverage. But Europe is still trying to diversify. It is signing free trade deals with countries like Australia, India, Indonesia, and Mercosur. Together, these markets represent more than 2 billion consumers. And this gives Europe new opportunities. But here's the problem. Even all these markets combined cannot replace the United States because the scale is simply too large. In 2024, Europe exported around $920 billion to the United States alone. Compare that to Australia, $40 billion, India, $81 billion, Indonesia, $16 billion, Mercosur, $31 billion. The gap is massive. And beyond trade, the US is also Europe's largest investment partner. It's where companies earn most of their overseas profits. So diversification can help, but it cannot replace the US. Now let's look at technology. This is where Europe is most vulnerable. Europe failed to create global tech giants during the early internet era. And today, it depends heavily on American companies. Firms like Amazon, Google, Meta, and Microsoft dominate the digital ecosystem. They control cloud infrastructure, software systems, AI development, and cybersecurity.